The first-class cabin buzzed with quiet conversations as passengers settled into their plush seats. Among them was Jonathan Carter, a successful businessman, enjoying a rare moment of peace with a book in hand. But the calm didn't last long. Seated beside him was Karen, an entitled woman with a sharp tongue and a superiority complex. The moment she saw Jonathan, her face twisted with disapproval. When the flight attendant served him before her, she exploded with rage, demanding special treatment and spewing thinly veiled racism. She had no idea who she was talking to. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire cabin, leaving Karen humiliated and everyone else applauding. Because karma was about to deliver its final blow. The cabin hummed with the low chatter of passengers settling into their seats as flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, preparing for takeoff. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was at full capacity, with business executives, families, and solo travelers filling the rows. Among them sat Jonathan Carter, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, quietly reading a book in first class. Seated next to him was Karen Whitmore, a woman in her 50s with sharp, scrutinizing eyes. She wore an expensive beige pantsuit, and her fingers were adorned with flashy rings that clinked together as she reached into her purse. From the moment she sat down, her attitude radiated an air of superiority. She sighed loudly as she took in her surroundings, her eyes flicking to Jonathan with visible disdain. She turned to the flight attendant, Sarah, a young, polite woman with a calm demeanor. "Excuse me," Karen said with an edge in her voice. "I specifically requested not to sit next to." Her voice trailed off as she made a vague gesture toward Jonathan, her face twisting in disapproval. Sarah, maintaining professionalism, replied with a polite smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is full. We're unable to accommodate seat changes at this time." Karen exhaled sharply and crossed her arms. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. As the plane took off, the flight attendants began their service, moving through the cabin with trays of drinks. When Sarah reached Jonathan's row, she smiled warmly. "Would you like a beverage, sir?" Jonathan looked up, returning her smile. "Yes, I'll have a glass of orange juice, please." Karen's eyes widened as Sarah poured the drink and handed it to Jonathan first. She clenched her fists and turned red with anger. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Why are you serving him before me? I'm a paying customer in first class. I should be served first." Sarah blinked, momentarily taken aback by the hostility. "Ma'am, we serve passengers according to our standard procedure. There is no specific order." Karen cut her off. "Don't give me that nonsense. I demand to be served first. This is outrageous." Passengers around them turned to watch the commotion. Jonathan sighed, closing his book slowly. He had encountered people like Karen before, entitled, condescending, and believing themselves superior. He debated whether to ignore her, but decided against it when he saw Sarah's discomfort. "I didn't realize beverages were served based on race," Jonathan said calmly, his deep voice carrying just enough edge to make Karen flinch. Karen scoffed. "Don't twist my words. This is about priority. It's common courtesy to serve ladies first." Another passenger, a woman sitting across the aisle, shook her head. "Lady, she's serving in the order she reached the seats." "It's not that deep." Karen shot her a glare. "Mind your own business." Then, turning back to Sarah, she snapped, "Where's your manager? I want to file a complaint." Sarah, keeping her composure, nodded. "I'll notify my supervisor, ma'am, but I assure you, our crew treats all passengers equally." Karen huffed, clearly unsatisfied. She snatched the menu and waved it around dramatically. "Fine. I'll have Perrier water with a slice of lime, not lemon. And make it fast." Sarah nodded, walking away quickly to avoid further escalation. The passengers continued watching, murmuring to each other about the entitled display. Jonathan shook his head, trying to return to his book, but Karen wasn't finished. She leaned toward him, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "I don't know what strings you pulled to get a seat up here, but let's be honest, you don't belong." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And where exactly do I belong?" Karen scoffed. "I don't know somewhere that isn't first class. People like you always try to take what isn't yours." Jonathan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's rich, coming from someone who just threw a tantrum over orange juice." Karen's face darkened with rage, but before she could respond, the supervisor, James, arrived. "I understand there's an issue?" he asked, professionally. Karen sat up straight, folding her arms. "Yes, I am being disrespected. Your flight attendant chose to serve him before me, and when I pointed it out, I was treated rudely." James looked at Sarah, who stood calmly, and then at Jonathan, who simply shook his head, signaling that he didn't want to be involved in this nonsense. "Ma'am," James said, turning back to Karen, "our service order is not determined by passenger preference, but by standard procedure. We treat everyone equally. If you feel you've been disrespected, I apologize, but I see no wrongdoing on my staff's part." Karen's mouth opened and closed as she struggled for a response. "This is discrimination against me as a loyal, paying customer. I demand a free upgrade. No, a refund for this treatment." James maintained his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, if you are unhappy with our service, you are welcome to file a formal complaint after landing." Karen fumed, realizing she wasn't going to win this battle. She turned back to Jonathan with an icy glare. "I hope you're happy," she spat. Jonathan smirked. "Actually, I was. Until you started ruining the flight." A ripple of chuckles moved through the nearby passengers. Karen, now fuming in humiliation, turned away, muttering angrily under her breath. For the remainder of the flight, she sat stiffly, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Jonathan, on the other hand, resumed his book unbothered. But karma wasn't done with Karen just yet. As the flight neared its descent, an unexpected announcement crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to recognize a special passenger on board today, Mr. Jonathan Carter." Passengers turned in curiosity as the pilot continued. "Mr. Carter is a renowned entrepreneur and philanthropist whose foundation has provided scholarships and opportunities to thousands of underprivileged students across the country. It is an honor to have him flying with us today." Karen's face drained of color. She slowly turned toward Jonathan, who was now smiling slightly, watching her reaction. Sarah, standing beside them, leaned down and whispered with a smirk, "Guess he does belong in first class after all." The entire cabin erupted into applause as passengers turned to shake Jonathan's hand, congratulating him. Karen, mortified, shrunk into her seat, realizing that the man she had spent the entire flight demeaning was someone far more important than she had ever imagined. As the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, Karen stayed in her seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Jonathan grabbed his bag and paused before exiting. With a small, knowing smile, he looked at Karen and said, "Next time, maybe judge someone by their character instead of their seat number." And with that, he walked off, leaving Karen with nothing but her shame.